Welcome to another Founder Wisdom Pod with Melissa Dinwiddie. She is founder at Creative Sandbox Solutions. Glad to have her on. This podcast is brought to you by podpire.com. If you want to start, scale, be invited to podcasts like this one. Melissa, welcome to the pod. Can you help me introducing yourself and tell us a bit more about your business?
Sure. Well, I'm happy to be here. Thanks for having me, Charles. Yeah, I am the founder and CEO of Creative Sandbox Solutions. We are a learning and development consultancy, and I work with senior tech leaders to help their teams connect and communicate better to have greater impact across the organization. And I do that through play-based methods. Everything I do involves play, because when people are playing, they're more engaged, they actually retain and remember things better, and we have fun when we're doing it. So we're actually doing strategic, transformational work, but it feels like fun.
Why did you decided to start that business?
Well, it's actually a bit of a story. I don't come from a corporate background. I actually had a business for 15 years as a professional artist. And I got very creatively blocked myself while I had this business. I made a lot of art for other people on commission, but I wasn't doing the art that I wanted to do for my own enjoyment. And I got really burned out. And back in 2010, I finally got back to making art for my own enjoyment. But it took a while because I realized that in order to get back to creating for myself, I had to tap into that inner 4-year-old. I had to get back to playing again. And honestly, I had forgotten how to play because I'd spent so long making art just to make money, just to, please my clients. I'd forgotten how to play. And so in order to get back into that mind space of being a 4-year-old, I am nothing if not a good student. I'm a good rule follower. So I had created a set of little rules for myself. And at the beginning, they were just a handful of these little rules. It was like, there is no wrong, and just be in the process of it, don't worry about the outcome and things like that. There were just a handful of these little rules. And over the next few years, those little handful of little rules expanded into 10. And at a certain point, I was invited by an online learning company to develop an online course, which was a marketing thing for them. And I developed this online course. And I had this this metaphor of being in the creative sandbox. And that's the space of, if you imagine a little kid and they're playing in a sandbox, they are not concerned about impressing other people or making money or winning awards. They're just exploring. They're just playing. They're just making messes and seeing what happens. And that is the space that I want to be in when I'm making art, when I'm making music. Anytime you're doing anything creative, that's the space that you want to be in. And so that metaphor of the creative sandbox has been really central for me. So these little rules that expanded out into 10, I now call them guideposts. That became the core of this online course, which then I ultimately turned into my book here, The Creative Sandbox Way. So it is all based around these 10 guideposts to help people tap into that inner 4-year-old, to be in that space that we have been trained not to be in through years of schooling, where we're taught to follow the instructions of the authority figure, and not just explore and play and make messes. And so I'm really helping people, whether it's artists or creatives or even business people, to really tap into that mind space of being a 4-year-old again. So back in 2010, I started making my own art again, and I determined that I wanted to get back to really living a creative life. And I started a blog called Living a Creative Life. And I actually started interviewing artists and creatives of all kinds who were making their living from their creative thing. I packaged all those interviews up into a virtual program, and I sold that as a little course and a community. And that was my first online offer. And then I started throwing spaghetti at a wall, and I basically built up a little online business. And I ultimately became a creativity instigator, helping people get creatively unstuck. And then meanwhile, I started leading creativity retreats. And my first one was in Istanbul, and then I came home and started leading them here in California. And back in 2013, been doing that every year. And several years ago, I realized as I was leading these retreats, every morning after breakfast, I would lead the participants through, I call them creative catalyzing sessions, to help people get out of their heads and into their bodies, because in your head is where those inner critical, self-judgment gremlin voices live. So we need to get out of our heads and into our bodies in order to get on with the business of creating freely, so that the gremlins don't drive the bus and shut us down and keep us paralyzed. So I lead these creative catalyzing sessions every morning after breakfast, and they're basically improv games and activities to get people laughing and moving. And I had kind of an epiphany where I realized, this is really my strength, is creating environments, creating spaces to work with teams and groups. So what am I doing running an online business? I should be working with organizations, with teams and groups. And that's when I decided to pivot to found my consultancy, Creative Sandbox Solutions. That's the story. So I know it's kind of long, but that's how I got here.
Can there be too much sandbox playing and too much spaghetti throwing at the wall? Because that's pretty much the story of my life and this podcast. It's experimenting stuff and not caring much about what people think. It's mostly about learning and scaling in my brain. So the removal of my ego. Can there be too much of that in a world that cares so much about their reputation and how they look out there?
Well, I think it depends on what your goal is. On the one hand, my initial response is, to some degree, there can never be too much. On the other hand, we always do have to have, there's a difference between divergent thinking and convergent thinking, right? So we need to have that divergent thinking, which is the creative sandbox time, which is exploring and making messes and not worrying about the outcome. And then at a certain point, we do have to edit and make decisions and send things out into the world and see how the world responds. If we're going to be an entrepreneur, right, we need to see how the audience reacts and which product idea or service idea are we going to run with, and then pivot and make, changes. So it's a constant dance. It's a constant back and forth. But we always need to carve out sort of dedicated, sacred creative sandbox time. And this, I think, is where a lot of people go wrong, especially creatives, whether your creativity is in the entrepreneurial realm or in the artistic realm. If you don't create dedicated time to have that creative sandbox experience where you're not concerned about what other people think, you're not concerned about money, you're not concerned about all of these external factors, then it really it causes problems. In my case, as an individual artist, it led me to get extremely blocked, extremely stifled. It really shut down my creativity, and it burned me out. For entrepreneurs and business people, it can really cause similar problems in that it's limiting what ideas are going to be generated. You need to have, just like Google has had that, whatever it is, that 5% time, or there was a period, I don't know if they're still doing it, but it was brilliant when they gave employees a certain amount of time to work on things that were of their own whatever they wanted to work on that was not, determined by their manager or determined by anyone else. Just go work on whatever you want. That's what I would call creative sandbox time. It's you go play and don't worry about the outcome. And amazing things can come from that.
I do agree with that. Why do people care so much about how they look out there, and why is it toxic to always care about your images and think that the world is going to end if someone points a finger at you?
Well, I think it's human nature. I mean, we're a tribal species, and we can't survive very well on our own. And so we're, just natively sort of terrified of, in certain cultures, there's the tall poppy syndrome. We're afraid we're going to get shut down. We're afraid we're going to get shamed. We're, at its most extreme, we're afraid we're going to get killed. Now, we may not literally be thinking that, but that's where, take that story to its extreme. And that's where that sort of internal fear goes. It's very real, that fear. So, we could talk about the psychology behind it, but it's leaning into that uncertainty and stepping out and putting yourself out there in any kind of way that's different is really, really scary. And so one of the things that I do is create environments, create containers that allow people to more easily do that, to more easily take those risks, lean into that uncertainty in a way that that lets them try things, lets them access that creativity that they might not even be aware that they have, which is so empowering.
Love it. And improv, games, cooperation and creativity are what you have your folks do during these workshops, quote unquote. Is it purely in person, or do you also do online events? And what's the difference that you see usually in both?
Yeah, so first of all, improv is one of my tools. It's one of my main tools, but I use a lot of different tools. I also use another tool called Lego Serious Play, which, yes, it actually uses Lego bricks to get people thinking with their hands. So that's another one of my primary tools. I use a whole variety of different play-based tools. Improv is one of my favorites for sure. But I basically work with my clients to find out what are the challenges that they want to deal with, what gaps do they have, what challenges do they have, and then from there, and where do they want to get to? And then from there, I design accordingly. And I use, grab from my toolbox and use what tools are going to be appropriate for the situation. And that varies. And now I'm forgetting what were the other questions that you had?
Yeah, the online and physical
right.
difference.
Yeah. So when I first started my consultancy, I envisioned it and started it as a fully in-person consultancy. And I was working with teams and groups completely in person. And then this little thing called a global pandemic happened. And that, of course, shut all the in-person experiences down. So for a while, I thought, well, now what do I do? And I was very active and still am on LinkedIn. And I was, noticing lots of conversations about people really struggling with what to do on Zoom and in virtual meetings and things. And I am really active in a large community of people who do use improv in our work in an applied way, and the Applied Improv Network. And we immediately started meeting on Zoom and holding these open space events to discuss and have sessions around what can we do? What works on Zoom? How can we sort of hack Zoom to work for our purposes? And I am like a sponge. So I just was soaking up and curating all kinds of activities. and I started leading workshops that I called non-boring virtual meetings workshops, and got lots of great feedback and started, tweaking and evolving those workshops. And as a result of that, I started getting companies like Facebook reaching out to me and asking, hey, we really need an offsite. Our people are really desperate and we have some, communications challenges or other challenges that we could use help with. Is this something you can help us with? And I started designing specifically 100% virtual workshops. And what was super interesting to me, Charles, is that because I had this opportunity because of the pandemic, I was able to design 100% virtual experiences that ended up being more transformative and more powerful in certain ways than I would have been able to had it been in person. And I'll tell you why. For one thing, if it had been in person, first of all, I might not have had the opportunity at all because they had their existing vendors. So that's one thing. And second of all, if it had been in person, I would have been brought in for like a one-day offsite. And the thing about a one-day offsite is you can have, you can get great insights, but you can't really get lasting transformation. Because if you think about it, in order to have lasting transformation, that happens over a span of time. You can't expect somebody to come in and give you an experience for a day and have that, sustain over the course of a year or more. Whereas if you bring somebody in to work with you over a span of time with your team, that's what's going to end up having sustainable, lasting impact and transformation for your team or your organization. So because these programs were virtual, you can't really do a day-long virtual program. Nobody could, people would just want to shoot themselves, So I had to design them as shorter chunks, smaller workshops over a span of time. So come in, do workshop 1, we meet again a week later for workshop 2, we meet again a week later for workshop 3. So several workshops over a series of weeks, which gave people an opportunity to design after workshop 1, design an experiment that they would run for themselves to get to practice something that they'd learned between workshop 1 and workshop 2. And then at the beginning of workshop 2, they get to report back on their experiment, how it went, what did they learn. So the result was, and the same thing between workshop 2 and 3, et cetera, the result was the impact and the transformation from these programs was so much more, so much deeper, so much more lasting than if I had been hired to come in and just do it like a day-long offsite.
Right. And if you deal with these tech personalities, which tend to be quite introverted, rigid, engineery, how do you teach them this EQ part of yours and this creativity? What tools do you use to break down their walls that sometimes are 100 feet high?
Well, they're the same tool. So I'm using activities from the world of theater and improv on these basically Zoom calls. And it's really all in the way I set them up for success, send them off into the breakout rooms, or sometimes it's all together in the main room. I call it my F.U.N method. So it's an acronym. F stands for find the flow. And that's the activity that we're all doing. And it may seem like it has nothing to do with the topic. Say it's communicating for influence, for example. We do some activity. They're really absorbed in it. Maybe it only takes 2 or 3 minutes to do the activity, but it's fun. It gets them laughing. It gets them engaged. Maybe it's challenging and silly. Then we come back for the U. And the U stands for unlock the meaning. And that's the debrief and discussion. And that's where they start to get light bulbs going off over their head. They start to connect the dots between what this activity is that they just did and how that relates to their day-to-day work lives, to communication or leadership or whatever the topic is. And insights are firing left and right. That's when they're unlocking the meaning for themselves. They're really in charge of the learning. I'm not lecturing at them. I'm not giving them a death by PowerPoint. They're creating the learning. And then the N stands for name the change, or another N is now what? So now what are you going to do with this? What is going to change as a result of what you just learned? And what's the experiment that you're going to run between now and the next time we meet? So they determine that for themselves. What's the most impactful thing? What's your biggest takeaway from the time that we've spent together today? And how are you going to implement that over the next week or 2 weeks or however long it is between now and the next time we meet? And this is why this is so sticky, this way, this fun method, this way of this interactive learning, because they get to determine what the learning is. It's super fun, it's super engaging, and it's very, very, as I said, it's very, very sticky. So I have people come back all the time and say, I was having a conversation with my cross-functional teammate, and it was so frustrated because I couldn't get them to understand something. And then I remembered the time traveler activity that we did. And I realized it was on me to figure out a way to explain it to them so that they could understand it. And it was that activity we did last week that helped me see how I could do that. And I was able to find an analogy that helped them understand it. And I was so excited. I was able to explain it so that they could understand. I get that kind of feedback all the time.
So speaking their language, basically connecting to their existing puzzle pieces. Melissa, where can we find out more about you and what you do?
Yeah, absolutely. So my website is creativesandbox.solutions. And I'm also super active on LinkedIn, where you can find me at Melissa Dinwiddie.
Love it. That was Melissa Dinwiddie and Charles Cormier for another Founder Wisdom podcast.com.